Hello, YouTubers. I've decided to make an attempt at putting together a list of 20 or so cars that you can buy for around $5,000 that are mostly fun but also hopefully reliable. Almost every single car I've autocrossed or driven on the track has been under about $6,000. And if you're a car guy like me, you might find yourself browsing Craigslist for cars that you may not even ever buy, but you're kind of like looking at it as like the shopping window of Craigslist. Even when you have no intention of buying, I still like to kind of fantasize about buying the cheapest car possible and turning it into a track car, or just like having a daily driver that's cheap to run and really good on gas and is still a lot of fun. And sometimes I'll even go as far into the research as to like look at, okay, what are the engine configurations, what are the common problems, um, what would I have to expect to repair on this as soon as I buy it, and what are the the pluses and minuses of all the cars I might come across. So here's my list of about 20 cars that I think have potential to be great track cars and are somewhat reliable, or are just great all around enjoyable cars that won't make you go broke. Hopefully. Okay, so number one, you know what's coming, but let me just get this one out of the way. MIATA stands for MIATA is always the answer, right? So it's very true if you're looking for something lightweight, rear wheel drive, super reliable. Weight is one of the most important factors when considering a track car, and the lighter it is, the faster it accelerates and brakes and takes corners. So you also, the benefit of that is that you don't need very big tires. You can go with a much smaller tire and still have the maximum level of grip that you'll ever really need. The engine is very reliable. It's very simple. It's a 1.8 liter. I would not necessarily recommend the 1.6, although you can go with them. It's just a lot of people are afraid to touch them because there's this like short nose crank issue where the crankshaft basically starts moving around in a way that you do not want it to move. So I would personally go with the 1.8, especially since you get more horsepower. It doesn't have a lot of horsepower from the factory. I'm not going to look it up at the moment, but I think it's about 130 or something, 140 horsepower, somewhere around there. But that's the thing about this car. It's not about straight line speed at all. It is just about car control, handling ability, and frankly embarrassing other people on track who are in really expensive cars because it's very satisfying to keep up with someone with a $80,000 Porsche in a $5,000 Miata, just because you're in a really great platform and you can, you have the skills to hang out with them on the track. The other thing I'd like to say about this car is if it makes a really good, dependable track car, it's probably going to make a very dependable daily driver too. So even if you're not going to take this to the track and just want something fun, I would go with this car too. As I said, engine is very reliable. It's very simple. Has a low compression ratio of 9.4 to 1. And a low compression ratio means it's pretty easy to tune for a turbocharger or a supercharger. It's just less risky when you're tuning it, essentially. I don't know the ins and outs of tuning. I just know that lower compression ratio, less likely to damage the engine when you're adding boost. Now, there are two main downsides that I have with Miatas. I owned two of them in the past, so I'm very familiar with them. And the first one's obvious. There's not much cargo space. You have a trunk that will maybe fit your carry-on, and that's a maybe. You can definitely put it in the passenger seat, but it's not a super practical car. I do remember moving out of one of my college apartments in a 1994 Miata, and thankfully to my Tetris skills, I was able to pack everything up and get it ready to go. But that flaw is pretty obvious, right? It's a really small car. It's very lightweight, not much storage space. Fine. You can live with that, that's fine. And a lot of people can. I can. The second less obvious downfall to this car is interior is not very well isolated from the road noise, the tire noise, and the wind noise. I remember trying to call people on the phone with like a headset on, and people would still be complaining, especially if I was on the highway, that it was just way too much noise for them to be able to hear me. So I just could barely ever have a phone conversation while driving this car. Even with people in the car with me, sitting in the passenger seat, at highway speeds, I would feel like I would have to yell at them constantly, and that's not a very pleasant thing to have to do. So it's very loud. Uh, but if you can put up with that, you know, there's really not many downsides to owning this car. It's meant to be a fun weekend, British roadster concept idea. Um, but as a daily driver, it does have its flaws. You will find these with higher mileage, 145,000 miles, 205,000 miles for this one. This one actually is kind of surprising. It looks like it's in pretty good shape. But that's the thing. These engines are not very stressed because they don't make a ton of horsepower per liter. They're very simple. You got the intake manifold, engine, spark plugs, exhaust. It's very simple. Yeah, most of the work on this car is very, very easy and pretty reliable. Now, there is another setback aside from the two I just mentioned. Having a convertible comes with its own challenges. I don't typically like convertibles very much because they do typically tend to be louder, and you risk the chance of someone ripping in and breaking into your soft top. And with MIATA hard tops, I remember 10 years ago you could buy a hard top for like $500, and now you're lucky to find one for under $1,000. The hard tops get stolen very easily as well. And I would never recommend a convertible to a college student, even though college students love convertibles. College campuses aren't the safest place for a convertible cars in general, really. But if you have a safe space for it, or if you could just put up with these things expecting the worst, just be prepared, definitely go for it. So that's enough about the Miata. I've gone on long enough. Here are some examples. This one only has 92,000 miles. I wonder if this is a rebuild. I do want to put another little disclaimer here. I am going to be listing cars above $5,000, kind of accounting for a little bit of negotiation on your part when you're actually going out to buy it. It's definitely becoming harder and harder to find cars without super high mileage for under $5,000. Just want to put that little disclaimer there. Number 2. Okay, so number 2 on this list is an EP3 Honda Civic Si. In my opinion, this is probably the ugliest car on this list. However, there's something that I actually really like about this car. It's kind of like an ugly duckling that turns into a swan when you get it on the back roads or get it to the track. It comes with the K20 A3 engine, which is the same as a RSX base model, and that's kind of known to be not a true VTEC engine because the VTEC is only applied to the exhaust valves or the exhaust ports, and it kicks in super early, and it's mostly made for better gas mileage. That being said, it's very lightweight, handles really well, it's really good gas mileage, and I almost bought one of these for about $2,500 a few months ago because I was in a tight space in need of a car on short notice. And I've kind of always wanted to own one of these to an extent, even though I recognize that they're not the greatest looking car in my opinion. They kind of look like mini minivans. Like if you shrunk a minivan down to a coupe, I feel like this is what you get. The downsides are the interior space isn't great. It's fine for how cheap these are. I think it's pretty acceptable. You get a steering wheel that is like the same as an S2000 wheel, which is pretty cool. But the shifter is kind of goofy looking, with coming out of the center console. But it is made to be really short to the steering wheel and shifting, so you can get those shifts in super fast without having to take your hand off the wheel for too long, I guess. But it's just a quirky design, and I think they made this from 2001 to 2005, and I don't know how prevalent parts are, so it might be a little bit difficult to find parts for. That being said, these ones actually look fairly clean. They're going to have high mileage, but most Hondas, if not pretty much all Hondas, are going to have like at least 100,000 miles at this price range because they are known to be very reliable. In all honesty, because it's so different looking, I feel like it would be a lot of fun to own this car. You just have to own the experience and be like, yeah, I'm in this, this little minivan slash car thing that actually is a ton of fun to drive. I think this is another solid choice. On to number 3. Number 3, very similar to the EP3 Civic, is the Honda Fit, at least in terms of design. Now, I only recommend the second generation from 2009 to 2014. I would actually stay away from the third generation, starting in 2014 or 2015, actually. Well, I don't know a whole lot about Honda Fits, but I know that a lot of people who are really into Honda Fits and Hondas in general say the third generation is not worth buying, and the first generation has too many issues that become bigger problems. But the second generation seems to be a very, very solid choice. Obviously, it kind of looks a lot like the EP3 Civic. I mean, if I put the EP3 Civic next to a Honda Fit, you would probably honestly think that this is just the next generation Civic. But this car is really light. It's 2,600 pounds. The engine makes 117 horsepower. In the city, you'll get 28 miles per gallon or 27, 28 miles per gallon city, and up to 33 or 34 miles per gallon highway. Not sure how accurate that is. I would obviously always recommend manual transmission, but honestly, if you really don't want to drive a manual transmission, I think it'd be fine in this case to get the automatic. A 1.5 liter, really small displacement, just again, light. Honda has always been really, really great at making four-cylinder engines that last a really long time. And you can find these with just under 100,000 miles for $5,000 right here. So, and there's actually a lot more utility in this car than it looks like from the outside. You can fold down the seats and kind of shift stuff around. That's all I really have to say about it. Haven't personally driven one of these, but I'd like to try it out sometime just for the fun of it. That's it for the Honda Fit. So I'm about to kind of group a bunch of different generations of Civics into one, starting with the EF and going all the way almost until the EP3 Civic. So the fourth generation Civic, starting with the EF Civic, this one right here, super cheap, very, very lightweight, means less gas, less expensive tires. I would highly suggest a Civic if you are looking for a combination of those things. That being said, these are starting to become more and more difficult to find, in decent shape especially. But they are so lightweight. They weigh about as much as a MIATA, if not less. Especially the EG hatches. These ones, or this is an EK hatch. Ton of miles, 224,000 miles. That is a lot of miles. It will not try to mislead you here. But they are known to be very, very cheap to run, very, very reliable, and always getting like at least 30 miles per gallon, if not the high 20s. This one has, you know, less than 100 miles, supposedly. Always be skeptical when you're looking at ads for these kinds of cars. But it seems like this one just needs a new front left fender and probably runs okay. The paint isn't in great shape, but you're getting a very, very light, fun car for very, very little money. With that all being said, Hondas are very, very well known for getting stolen. Now, if you have somewhere to store this safely, or you feel confident that yours is not going to get stolen for whatever reason, more power to you. There are rumors that Honda only made like a certain number of keys, so your key is like has a 1 in 30 chance or something of unlocking another Civic's door and starting it up. Uh, I don't know what extent that's true. I think they actually made way more than that. My guess is that what's really happening is that the key cylinder for the lock cylinder is actually just gets worn out because these cars are really old and maybe they didn't do a great job designing the keys. And that's what's really happening. You can just, I mean, I remember one of my dad's vans used to start without a key at all. That was like a early 90s GMC van. So different car, but same kind of issue. But that being said, lightweight, fun, very cheap on gas. I'm honestly really surprised this Civic Si is only six grand $500, $6,500. I mean, always go with a manual transmission when it comes to a Civic like this because otherwise, I just don't think it's as much fun. I'm now seeing, obviously this headlight does not line up so well. I was thinking this would be an insane deal if it were really clean, but apparently it's seen better days. No door handle over here, and the front bumper is having a lot of issues staying in its spot. But they're very simple cars, so if you can manage to find one from any of these generations, it doesn't matter if it's an SI or not. It's really lightweight. The aftermarket support, like they've made so many. I would maybe go for it. I've thought about getting an EG or EK hatch before just because they are so incredibly light. I think they actually weigh like 2,000 pounds or something like that. It's kind of insane. But either way, just be aware they have a higher probability to be stolen. Moving on to number 5, the ACURA Integra. This is pretty much the same category car as a Civic, but just a little bit more. How do I say this? It has a little bit better of a reputation as a car overall than a Civic does. Acura kind of always branded themselves as like an upper scale Honda, and this is back in the days where they shared a lot more parts than they currently do. This is a great car. I mean, here's a GSR, has a ton of miles on it. Again, they're Honda motors. They run for a very long time, but do be aware there are issues with having a car that has this many miles on it. So, as much as I like to recommend these, if high miles makes you nervous, don't get one of these. And these are also known to be stolen very frequently as well. I mean, here's one here for 100,000 miles, only 4 grand, less than $4,000. This is real. Like, this thing should probably sell. Oh, it's an automatic. Sorry. Okay, this one here. No, still a ton of miles, almost 300,000 miles, which is quite insane. Um, but it does look pretty clean, pretty much inside and out. And I would personally probably say stick with the 1990 models and newer after they switched from pop-up headlights to non-pop-up headlights with this body style. This one actually has the JDM conversion here. Yeah, 144,000 miles isn't too insane for a car that is known to be one of the best front-wheel drive handling cars ever. It's going to be really cheap on gas, really reliable, generally speaking, especially if it's been taken care of. Like, this one actually looks really nice. Don't know enough about Hondas to know if that's an engine swap. Yes. It's a B18C engine type R head. So again, this is a obvious project car here, but parts are still pretty common to come by. And the Integra handles really well. Again, more likely to be stolen, but you kind of have to know what you're getting into. Number 6. Number 6 is the Honda Civic made from 2006 to 2011. If you can find an SI model for a good price, I would say definitely go for it over an EX or the LX or whatever else trim levels they had out there. I would probably not personally go for the hybrid or the what is it, the natural gas vehicle versions of these. I would just stick to the very basic four-cylinder engine versions. I would definitely get a transmission that's a manual transmission because Honda's really known for making great shifting transmissions in most of their cars, if not pretty much all of them. I wouldn't want to miss out on that, especially the fun that comes with learning and driving a manual transmission, obviously. But the sedan has a little bit more of a following, and it's much more practical in terms of cargo space and hauling people around and whatever. Compared to the Civics of the 90s and even the ones that came after 2011, in my opinion, it seems like the build quality was just so good. These really hold together very, very well, even after all the years and miles that are put on them. So I'm actually kind of surprised that you can find so many for like 6 grand with less than 100,000 miles, or maybe if you stretch your budget a little more, you can get one with even less mileage on it. Here's one. It's a coupe. I would prefer the sedan, but the coupes are fine too. $6,500, 80,000 miles. It's pretty crazy. It's really just because they made so many of these. There are so many out there that they're not rare in any way. The SIs, which are a little bit harder to find when it comes to picking up the sedan because they are more popular for some of the reasons I listed. And you get a pretty modern interior. It's not, high tech by any means, but pretty nice. Unfortunately, like the 2001 to 2005 Civics, the 2001 to 2005 Civic had very little aftermarket support. I think it's because the engine just wasn't meant to be anything but economical. Its purpose was just to get really good gas mileage and be practical. You could still, if that's what you're looking for, it's still a lightweight car that might be fun to own, but it's just very, very few people end up buying this generation Civic and doing much at all with them. The generation that came after seemed to be a lot better in terms of build quality, reliability, fun to drive combination. The other ones are probably perfectly fine in terms of reliability, if not even more so. But in general, this generation of Honda is great. Like most of the cars on this list, I've seriously considered picking one of these up. Just, have something that gets really good gas mileage and is cheap and reliable. Just want to reiterate, you can stretch your budget to like almost 8 grand. I know that's not 5 grand, um, but 7.5 grand, you can get a Civic Si with not that much more than 100,000 miles. I would certainly go that route every time, especially but only for the sedan version. This one looks like it might have a little bit of issues with its hood, the paint here, and with this generation of Civic, the paint doesn't really last a lot longer than most cars. I've seen a lot of these Civics with the clear coat coming off it very obviously, but for a good condition sedan, I think that's a very fair asking price. It will still feel relatively modern compared to a lot of the other cars I've listed, and it'll be fast enough. It'll be a lot of fun. So, yeah, go with the sedan. Stretch your budget a little bit if you can. If not, the base model Civics are totally fine too. They're down on horsepower, but you'll get great gas mileage, and the build quality is really, really solid. Like even with an EX, city miles per gallon 30, highway 38. So All right. Getting to number 7 is the RSX Type S specifically. If you can get one of these with relatively low miles, which will probably be approaching 120,000 miles at this point, considering their age, it's a nice option. I wouldn't want to suggest a base model just because for not that much more money, for 40 more horsepower, you can get a much more tunable engine. The engine that came in the base model was the K20A3, which is the same engine that came in the EP3 Civic that I've already gone over. But the Type S comes with the K20A2 that has about 200 or so horsepower. I'm sure, a base model might be enough for some of you out there, especially if this is a first car and you still get, a decently nice ACURA that handles pretty well and looks pretty decent in my opinion. And I don't really know of any major downsides to this car. It has a really solid engine. The interior is, it's relatively modern on the inside. Again, it's an Acura / Honda, so it's going to have a ton of miles on it, but you do get a decent car for what it is. Like this one's only $4,000. Yes, it is approaching 200,000 miles. But you get a 6-speed manual, 200 horsepower, pretty good gas mileage, really good reliability. That being said, higher the miles on your car, the more risk you're going to be taking. So maybe stretch your budget a little bit more past what you might feel comfortable with now to find something with less miles. Let's see, this one has also 200,000 miles, but that being said, that kind of shows you there are a bunch of examples of these with a ton of miles. So if you can find one with 130,000 miles, then, and not for too much more money, this could be a really solid choice for a fun, cheap car. Fun, cheap car that's fairly, really reliable, not bad on tires, and that's pretty much it. It's great overall. Another solid choice. I actually looked at one of these in person because I was very, very close to buying one, like most of the cars on this list. But I do remember feeling like Hondas are known to not make a lot of torque. I haven't driven a ton of Hondas, but you don't feel the power that the engine is making when there's really low torque and really higher horsepower. So when I drove one, I felt like, oh, this isn't nearly as much power as I thought it'd be. That being said, it revs like past 8 grand, which is very fun, and it is faster than it feels. So on a track, if maybe I had an opportunity to drive one on a racetrack, I'd feel differently. But 200 horsepower for a really reliable engine, that's great. I mean, Mazda's ND MIATA has a 2-liter that only makes 181 from the factory. Gets better gas mileage and it'll probably have better reliability in the long term anyway, or if not about the same. But still, this car, the Type S, came out 20 years ago and made more horsepower. Like, that's very impressive. The K series engine is very respectable. Number 8. So if you're still looking for lightweight, but can handle doing some repairs and maintenance, a Mini Cooper might be a great choice. These feel a lot like front-wheel drive go-karts, and have had opportunities to drive these and have had a great time. I generally don't recommend these because they're not known for their reliability in any way, especially the Mini Cooper S. Yeah, depending on what model you're, it either has a supercharger or a turbocharger. I would probably opt for the supercharged version just because superchargers are a bit less simple in design, so maybe a little less opportunity for failure. I'm not a Mini Cooper expert. I haven't done enough research to know, but you can find these very, very easily for under 6 grand at the very least with less than 100,000 miles. Now, I would even go as far as to say maybe even don't go with a turbo or supercharged version. That way you can save yourself some headache with reliability and still have a ton of fun. Like I said, I mean, these are front-wheel drive go-karts. They really feel like that. But the downside is they don't really have the best interior, in my opinion. I've never really liked the interior in a Mini Cooper. It all just feels very like cheap, plasticky, and kind of loud. It just feels like I'm not really in a car that is very nice. It doesn't feel like a typical BMW experience that you might expect, considering Mini is owned by BMW. The shifter is like super light, like the actual shifter itself. Handle is just like feels really cheap to me, and the shifting of the gears feel fine, but they're not very reliable. And please stay away from the convertible versions for the reasons I kept in the MIATA that I've already covered. But, you know, window regulators, I've had second-hand experience with this. I had a friend who owned a convertible Cooper S, and he just felt like it was such a headache. He enjoyed driving it because it's a lot of fun, but is it really worth adding even more complexity to a car that is known to not have a good track record for reliability? In my opinion, no way. I would only go with a hardtop version. But yes, things like, you're putting up with BMW special parts in some cases, especially when it comes to the electronics and diagnostic tools. It has to be specifically BMW branded in certain cases. But if you're willing to put up with these things, I would say it could be a lot of fun. Know what you're getting into. You're buying a very fun car for very little money. And there's a reason why these things get great track times in certain cases. Tires are super cheap. These only weigh about 20, I think they're 2,500 pounds. That's like right between, that's less than an S2000, not that much more than a Miata. It's a great option, and it has way more utility than you're going to get in a Miata. So know what you're getting yourself into, do a little bit of research. They're great fun. Number 9, I feel like this car kind of is forgotten or has become forgotten to a large extent. There are so many Nissan SER spec-vs that are right around $5,000 or less with not that many miles. This one right here, it's not in the greatest shape. So, but let's just be realistic here. It's not in the best shape, but it's 3 grand, 70,000 miles. The Nissan SER Spec V came with a 2.5 liter 4-cylinder, making 175 horsepower. The current Miata, again, the ND Miata, which isn't really like a slow car, it's adequate power. It only has 5 more horsepower at 181 horsepower in a current Miata that you buy today, 20 years later, 15-ish to 20-ish years later. So this thing is going to get pretty solid gas mileage. It's going to be very reliable, very practical, and it's so cheap. I again, I test drove one of these cars once because I was considering buying one. I don't know what kept me from buying it at the time. I think it was probably around the time right before I bought a Miata, my first Miata, because I was thinking I needed something more practical. Oh, wait, this is a 1.8S. This is not listed properly, is it? Something's off about this car, so I'm gonna close this one. But yeah, I don't understand how they're so cheap compared to like Civics and everything. The one thing I will say is that there is a very common issue with these engines. There are butterfly valves on the intakes, which have screws which essentially become loose and drop into the engine and destroy your pistons. and probably other parts on the engine as well, but that is not a great issue to have. However, it is not a very intense repair job. You just have to take off the intake, put some Loctite on the butterfly screws, and you'll be good to go. It should be very reliable after that. Not that it won't be reliable before then. It either is reliable and then it breaks, or you fix it and it continues to be reliable and doesn't break. And I think the interior in these are actually better than most cars that I've seen. I personally like the front bumper. They did a facelift. I like the bumper from the year 2000 to 2003. I feel like it has a more aggressive, it almost kind of reminds you of like the Skyline design with like the more vertical lines here. The design I do not like are the taillights. It honestly looks like the designers forgot to like design the rear end of this car. It almost doesn't even look like it's from the same car. If you look at it from front to back, it's like, okay, there's this like fairly aggressive looking front end, with the bumper, fairly standard, doors on it, nothing spectacular. And you get to the end and it's like, well, what is, like, who cares what this is? It's just some kind of bubbly looking rear end. So that, if that's enough of a deal breaker, fair enough. But I think it's pretty solid. I think some of them came from the factory with like Sparco steering wheels and shifters, something like that. But the Sentra SER of this generation, after the facelift, I feel like they took away a lot of the aggressive styling. It looks very standard, almost just like a standard Maxima or something. So yeah, I just personally prefer the newer or the older bumper. This obviously, did they make a spec-v in automatic? I don't know, but either way, they're kind of hard to come by. I think that might be why they're so cheap, is because maybe parts are really difficult to find. That's not something I am just aware of. I just don't know. But if you are looking at a Civic, I don't know if there's any reason why not to give one of these a shot, just to see how it goes. They're very cheap, going to have a lot more horsepower and a lot more torque than any Honda engine is going to give you for the same price. And yeah, just seems like a lot of fun. Another solid choice. Lightweight. I mean, they are a little bit heavier than than the 90s Civics that I kind of bunched all together into one category at 2,700 pounds, but it's I still think it's a solid choice for if you want reliability, decent gas mileage, good fun, relatively lightweight. Number 10. If you're looking for something a little more unique, but overall like the concept of front wheel drive, reliable, good gas mileage, but a lot of fun, it doesn't make a lot of power. I think it only has like 130 horsepower, but they weigh under 2,700 pounds, a little bit lighter than the Nissan. And Mazda is one of my favorite car manufacturers, because they really know how to make a great, good handling car that is a lot of fun to drive, but is still very practical. And I've always felt like their cars have always had a bit nicer of an interior compared to the same class of cars, like Hondas of the same generation. It just seems like their build quality is just a little bit nicer. That's just my perception. Whether or not that's true, I've never owned a Protege or even a Honda, so I can't really say. But that's just always the impression that I got. It just seemed like it was just a little bit nicer, little slightly like one step up, one half step up. And the Protege 5 specifically has a ton of cargo space, so it's very, very practical. You'll still get really good gas mileage. The crazy thing is, they actually even made a Mazda Speed Protege, and that would be a ton of fun. Like, getting a turbocharged engine that's stock for less than $5,000. The funny thing is, this is the only Protege for sale I can see in all of the United States at the moment. I searched all over the place, and this is the only one, but it's still less than 5 grand. Um, that being said, this isn't like a lot of other turbocharged cars where you can just crank the boost up and have a bunch of horsepower on hand, just from a simple tune. Uh, it seems like from everything I've read, the engine output of like 170 horsepower or something like that from this turbocharged 2 liter pretty much maxed out where it is coming from the factory. So don't expect to get this car and slap a tune on it and make like 200 something horsepower. It's already approaching its limit from the factory. That being said, I'm sure, it's not terribly unreliable. Hopefully, I don't know a ton about its reliability, but they're pretty hard to come by, just like the Sentra. But the other proteges, I would say get the last generation facelifted one. I really like the Protege 5 and how it looks. Um, it's not like you'd never think this is like a new car that came out last year by any means, but I still think this one especially looks really solid. What is this? 151,000 miles, but based on its condition, it looks like it was really well kept. It's only 5 grand. Again, can't expect to find many cars with low miles for under 5 grand that are super reliable, but I think this is one of them. It only has 80,000 miles. It's automatic. I think you can go either way with this transmission, with manual or automatic. Me, obviously, having a preference for manual transmissions because I think they're more fun and engaging. But if you're just looking for something practical, decent gas mileage, reliable, Protege 5, especially if you need more cargo space. Number 11, the Mazda 3. So, the Mazda 3 is basically like an updated Protege that I just mentioned. If you want something a little newer than the Protege, but still like Mazda for the reasons I listed, fun to drive, good handling, practical, pretty good reliability. I don't think in general that are going to be as reliable as Honda, but I don't think they're going to be that far off either. You can easily find a Mazda 3 for not much more money, if any at all. In my opinion, the first generation Mazda 3 will actually look pretty nice for a long time. Again, you're not going to mistake it for a brand new car, but I do think that they did a really good job, especially with the hatchback on the styling here. That being said, it took me a long time, actually, in my opinion, to start getting into the look of hatchbacks. Like, I didn't really appreciate them until, I started looking at them and seeing their practicality. And it's just, I like hatchbacks now much more than I did when I first got into cars. And the hatchbacks are supposed a little bit better in terms of front weight balance distribution from front to rear compared to the sedans, at least. That being said, the sedan's a good way to go too if you don't need the cargo capacity and you don't need to haul very much, then go for a sedan. You can get them with the manual transmission. I would strongly recommend this. In college, it was Mazda 3 of the second generation, which shared a lot of Ford parts. So this is when Mazda had a partnership with Ford at the time, using a lot of similar parts to the Ford Focus chassis. You can kind of see some similarities when you look at them side by side. But if you actually are willing to stretch your budget a little more, you can get the first generation Skyactiv engine, which is a 2.0 liter. I believe it made 145 horsepower, but it got 30 miles per gallon city and like 39 or 40 miles per gallon highway, which is really incredible in my opinion. I've never been able to, get any car I've owned to get 30 miles per gallon. They started using that technology in the newer Mazda 3s. They all use it. They all use the Skyactiv technology as far as I'm aware now. And if you are looking for a Skyactiv model, you will be looking for two things here. or at least two things. There are three ways to kind of identify whether or not it's Skyactiv. One would be the blue color around this specific part right here on the headlight. Then the rear badge here says Skyactiv with that same color blue. And if this one has a picture of the engine bay, yep, here's one. This is also letting you know this is the Skyactiv engine. So if you want like crazy good gas mileage and don't care as much about horsepower, definitely get the Skyactiv. They only made it for like 2 or 3 years, I think, from it was either 2011 to 2013 or 2012 to 2013. But yeah, I've considered getting this just to save money on gas. Getting 30 miles per gallon is really good. And overall, gas mileage only saves you as much as you like drive around all the time. So if you don't do a whole lot of driving, I wouldn't put as much weight into gas mileage. But with that being said, if you want the older generation, or if you don't really care that much about horsepower and you don't care as much about gas mileage and you care more about horsepower, then I'd say go with the 2.3 engine that makes 160 horsepower. It's pretty obvious. It always says it like on the front door if it's a 2.3 or not. Yep, 2.3. Yep, another 2.3 there on the front doors. So yeah, I would say the Mazda is a solid choice. Definitely has decent interior in my opinion, and I think they drive great. So I think that's all I have to say about that. As a little bit of an added bonus, I'm going to include the Mazda Speed 3. If you are not afraid of higher mileage cars, then and you're not afraid of some challenges that might come from owning a higher mileage turbocharged engine, the Mazda Speed 3 is a great way to go. I am kind of shocked that I was able to find as many for like under $6,000 as I'm able to now, even though they are, 143,000 miles. It's pretty high. I have had rumors of people telling me like the engines aren't very well balanced, so just be aware that like they might not have they're probably not going to have the longevity of something that's naturally aspirated, no turbo or supercharger. Um, but if you can put up with that kind of things that come with owning a more higher performance car, like the Mazda Speed 3, then I say definitely go for it. I believe these came with 260 horsepower, 275 horsepower from a 2.3 liter turbo. They do have a little bit of room to grow and increase the boost and make a lot more horsepower. Honestly, just looking at these, I'm almost considering like taking a look just for fun and deciding if I want to buy one of these. I mean, $6,000 for like 175 horsepower? That's pretty nice. And the thing is, there's a lot of rumors, a lot of speculation, I should say, about whether or not the 2.3 engine and the Mazda Speed 3s were the predecessor or the same family engine to the current Ford EcoTech or EcoBoost, sorry, the Ford EcoBoost engines, especially the one in the Ford Focus RS, but also the 2.3 turbo Mustangs. So parts should be around for the engine at least for a long time. They did make a lot of these. You can even find the second generation for 122,000 miles for $6,000. Yeah, so if you're patient and you really like these, which I do, I say take a test drive. Just be aware turbos add complexity to your engine. They might decrease the reliability. But overall, I think it's a really good package, especially if you don't mind having front wheel drive. Could be a lot of fun. Stores a lot of stuff. Maybe a really great car for, especially if you're like in college. Yeah, I would definitely look into one of these. Yeah, do watch out for salvage titles though, or rebuilt titles. This one's been rebuilt. That's why this one is particularly cheap. But hey, sometimes that doesn't scare people off. especially if it was a minor damage and you don't care about resale value, especially when the purchase price isn't very high. Why not go for it? Especially if you're going to be like tracking it and thrashing it around. There's no point in making sure you have a clear title or a clean title if you're going to have a track dedicated car. So it has another added bonus car to the Mazda 3. I am going to point to the Mazda Speed 6 as well. This basically uses the same engine as the Mazda Speed 3, but it weighs a bit more and has all-wheel drive. It's a Haldex system, which means it's usually front-wheel drive, and it sends power to the wheels only when the front wheels are losing traction. That being said, be prepared. These cars will be a little bit more expensive to run and maintain, but this one has less than 90,000 miles. It is less than 7 grand. I can't believe how cheap these things have gotten, considering how much performance you get for your money. And like, it's pretty nice. Yes, there's a bunch uh, of the clear coat peeling off and just disappearing because of the sun damage. But that can be fixed with another paint job or whatever. If you want to wrap it or plasti dip it, fine. Um, but these are really solid cars. It's like getting like the predecessor to a Focus RS practically. Um, yeah, you're not going to be able to make 350 horsepower as reliably as a Focus RS, but both the 6 and the 3 have top mount intercoolers. See here. But yeah, they're really solid cars. Sometimes people do have problems with, I think, the rear differentials, and so you do have to watch out for those. But if you're not going to be like pushing this car to its limit every day, and you just want a fun, fast car that's a daily driver, I would give this one a shot for sure. I know there is a good bit of aftermarket um, aftermarket support for these. This one kind of has a lot of rust, obviously on the front edge of the hood, but these are out there. I mean, I would consider one of these if I was looking for something fun and fast. If you might have to or you might have to stretch your budget a bit to get something in better shape and lower mileage. But yeah, I would say these definitely have better interiors than a Mitsubishi Evo, at least an 8 or a 9. But that's just my opinion. I think Evo 8 and 9 interiors are pretty bad, especially compared to something like this, but you're still getting a 4-cylinder turbo that's sometimes all-wheel drive. Yeah, it's not going to handle as well as an Evo, but it's a different car. One additional note about this, most Mazda 6s have rear splitting seats, like the 60-30 split rear seats, so you can fold them down and get really long items in the trunk. The Mazda Speed 6 has reinforcement, so as you can see in this image, this is what you will see. If you do choose to modify your car to have the rear folding seats, and you take out this, if you take out this interior panel, you will at least be able to use this space. If you take that out and put folding seats in the trunk or in the rear seats, but do be aware these are probably going to be somewhat sharp edges, so you're not really going to get the same utility as you might hope for. It's not like you can just change the seats out and get the same utility. They don't have as much cargo capacity. That's just that simple. The funny thing is, you can actually just cut out this interior piece in the trunk and still fold down the seats. This interior panel in the trunk, you can cut that and basically have folding seats that actually allow access into the trunk, so you can put really long items in here. That might be just something worth noting for this car if you're really interested in taking a serious look at it. Number 12. So the WRX is one of the lightest all-wheel drive cars you can buy. The EJ205 has been around for a very long time. That's the engine that they came with and they've stuck with until the current generation. So it has a flat 4 engine, top-mounted intercooler here, which is the reason why it has the small hood scoop so the intercooler can cool the air a little bit better going into the engine. It has a low center of gravity, which helps its handling capability. The downside is that the head gaskets tend to fail after so many miles, probably somewhere around 100,000. But I'm really not sure what the general consensus is there. One head gasket per pair of cylinders on both sides. But once you fix those head gaskets, and if they do go bad, hopefully they'll last a pretty long time. So just be prepared to replace them if you're buying used, or find out when the previous owner replaced them so you can know you're at least safe for another so many miles. Probably, I'd say 50,000 to be just on the conservative side. Now, Subarus have like a really dedicated following. There's a lot of aftermarket support for these. As long as you're not like drag racing this car and doing really harsh clutch drops and just doing really hard launches, I wouldn't be as afraid of like the really delicate transmissions that people claim these have. If you're going to be driving it harder and autocrossing it constantly and even doing moderate track driving, I would be a little more concerned maybe, but just something to be aware of. That's a common issue with these cars. But you can find them with higher mileage, 150,000 miles. It's definitely getting up there. But it's a really cheap car, 7 grand, 130,000 miles. Um, decent interior. If you get the wagon, you get a ton of cargo space, which is nice to have. I think they all came with like the Momo steering wheel, which is kind of cool. At least a bunch of them did. Yeah, there's kind of a lot of options for these out there. I've never been like that crazy about their interior space. I think it just looks okay. It's about on par as an Evo interior, but I'm not a big fan of the Evo interior of this generation. But I mean, for what you get, you're getting this like all-wheel drive car, turbo, lots of fun, makes fun noises. I think it's a pretty decent option. I especially like the seats that came in the Hawkeye version. What is what they're called? These are called. So it goes Bug-Eye, then Blob-Eye, Hawkeye, then something else, and then Evo-Eye, because the current generation kind of looks like an Evo, but kind of just because they're all so similar underneath the body, people don't really like have a reference for referring to the different facelifts, essentially. So they're all mostly the same. They all came with the 205 EJ205 engine. And so if you're not afraid of the reliability of these, I would say they're a really solid choice. And the high mileage, again, all these cars have really high mileage, but you're only paying 5 grand less, hopefully. Now, another bonus car to the WRX is the Saab 92X Aero. And just from this brief search, it seems like you can get them almost for better prices than a WRX, but for about the same mileage. Now, they probably made a lot more automatics in the Saab version. If not, seems like maybe all of them. I'm not sure. Don't quote me on that. Um, but if you want an automatic transmission, the Saabs actually had slightly nicer interior spaces, and they came with better sound deadening from the road noises. And they're all wagons. So make sure you get the 92X Aero. That designates that it's the turbo, the WRX version with a turbo. The standard 92Xs, like the linears, don't have a turbo. If you want a base Subaru Impreza, that's fine. You could get the Saab 92X linear. It's basically the same thing. I like Saabs. I'm kind of biased towards them. I would maybe consider the Saab 92X Aero, but they don't seem to come in manual transmissions very often, if at all. So, yeah, just something to note. And if you get one of these, you get to say you own a Subaru, because people seem to really like saying that for some reason. And it's true. It's mostly a Subaru, but it has a Saab badge. Number 13, the Neon SRT4. A lot of people don't like referring to the SRT4 as a Neon SRT4 for some reason. It is clearly based on the Neon chassis. It is clearly a Neon that has a different front bumper and hood. So I don't know why people get offended or seem to get offended. Maybe that's just a myth more than anything else. But um, it's just kind of funny to make poke fun at other car enthusiasts sometimes that way, which is fine. It's all in good fun for the most part. But these are pretty cheap. They're actually getting a little bit more hard to come by as well, especially for the price that I'm looking at them for. But you can find them a little bit higher than 5 grand, around 7. Hilariously, all of these are listed at almost the exact same price, except for this one. This one's 5 grand, but because it doesn't seem to have great paint on the hood, which also seems to be a really common issue with these hoods. And I'm not sure why. Maybe someone in the comments can tell me why these cars have so many issues on the hood. I don't know. When these first came out, I think it was 2003, they all have the 2.4-liter turbocharged engine, which seems to be fairly robust. First came out with 215 horsepower, which then the next year was released with 230 horsepower, which is very respectable, especially in a lightweight car like the Neon. Some people really, really can't stand the look of these cars for some reason. I honestly think they don't look that bad. I think they look pretty good for what they are, especially. I mean, a lot of people seem to like the Abarth, the Fiat 500 Abarth, which I think the exhaust notes on the Neon SRT4 sound almost identical to the Abarth, and this one makes a lot more horsepower and will be a good amount cheaper for a long time. Plus, these engines can handle like upwards of 350 horsepower on the stock engine just by tune and basic bolt-on parts. So that's a lot of fun. Some people have probably reached like 400 horsepower as well. I've noticed also that it's kind of hard to find a Neon with like really good front bumper to headlight alignment. It just seems like there's always this little bit of a gap that kind of turns me off from them. But if you can find one in like really good condition, like this one looks practically perfect from the outside almost. Looks like the rear bumper has been repainted. It's hard to tell that sometimes because the material might be different, like metal versus plastic. One just looks like it's been detailed. But I've always really liked the seats in this car. The seats definitely hug you in really well. The shifter was always kind of interesting because it was this like really long Hurst type shifter with this big boot on it. But the seats I always like these seats. They always seem to hug you pretty well. It's really good if you're going to be taking it to the track. So yeah, I mean, a lot of side bolstering. That seat is very worn, but it's an old car, a lot of miles, but it's going to be pretty quick and probably a lot of fun to drive. A lot of people complain about the interior. Again, it's no worse than an Evo interior, so why complain about this interior? I think if I had to take between an Evo 8 and 9 interior and an SRT4 interior, I'd probably take this one. I mean, you're really going to argue that this interior right here is that much better or different even than this one? Like, they practically look identical to me. It's cheaper made plastic because it's a budget car based on an economy car that's made to be really fast. Yes, with the Evo, you're in a much more respected car that does have better performance, but if you're just looking for a cheap car that's going to be fast and fun, I would definitely say go with an SRT4 if you're kind of interested. Now, that all being said, the wheels tend to have very specific fitment that you need to follow, so there are not very many options for aftermarket wheels and tires, or just wheels specifically. because there isn't a whole lot of space. I believe it's between the shock and the brake caliper. There just isn't a whole lot of wiggle room there. There's just not many options out there that have the right wheel size. So be aware of that. There just aren't very many wheel options, which is why so many of them keep the stock wheels on them, like you can see here. All of these have stock wheels. Other than that, it's a fairly robust engine, but it's getting up there in mileage, so just be aware. You might need to be doing your basic maintenance. I would be prepared to do that immediately. And I'd try to find a stock one if possible, but that might be even more of a challenge. So, number 14 is the Cobalt SS, or Ion Redline. So the Cobalt SS was essentially the GM version of an SRT4. It was also trying to get into that tuner culture scene that the imports seemed to be having a very strong hold on at that time, especially. It used an Ecotec block, which was basically the four-cylinder that all GM cars came with pretty much, but it was supercharged, and it was a 2.0 liter, made 205 horsepower if I got the numbers correct, and it was a fairly reliable engine. I owned a Cobalt LS, so I have some personal experience. The interior space is decent, I would say. The steering wheel isn't the prettiest by any means. The funny thing is, a lot of people complained who were Corvette owners that it comes with the same steering wheel as a Cobalt. So Corvette owners were complaining that a Cobalt had its same steering wheel, while Cobalt Cobalt owners were praising it for having the same steering wheel as a Corvette. So it's just kind of a funny story behind it, I guess. I think this is a really solid car, especially for the price. The performance is really solid. So from 2005 to 2007 or 2008, it came with that 2.0 supercharged engine. But then in 2008 and newer, it came with a turbocharged version of the engine. I think this is the LSJ versus the LNF engine codes. And this engine came with 260 horsepower, which is a huge step up from the supercharged version. And it also had 260 pound-feet of torque. Came with redesigned wheels. I know a lot about this car because I was so interested when I had my Cobalt LS, wishing I had was able to afford the SS of the time. Also, the front grille is a little bit different. It has more of like a honeycomb-ish type of grille design instead of the more straightforward, lines in the front grille. So I would definitely say try to find the turbocharged version. That being said, the supercharged version is probably perfectly reliable as well. If not, you could get the benefit of a little bit more simple of a design. And I know that you can tune these to be about as fast as an SRT4 in terms of power output after modification. You can probably get to the mid 300 horsepower range, 350, maybe approaching 400. But don't quote me on that. Do your own research. But another very interesting fact about the 2008 Cobalt SS is that it did a Nürburgring lap time in 8 minutes and 22 seconds, which is the same amount of time an E46 M3 did the Nürburgring. This car right here does the Nürburgring in the same amount of time that the very classic and quickly appreciating E46 M3. That is quite impressive, in my opinion. They really did do a good job tuning the suspension to perform well in the '08 and up Cobalt. Unfortunately, not many people really recognized it for that, but that's okay. The interior wasn't as good as other cars, but I thought it was fine. I mean, it's meant to be an affordable, fun, fast car, and that's what it was. One issue that I am definitely aware of is that the electric power steering sometimes randomly quits on you. I know this because I was delivering pizzas at the time in my Cobalt LS when my power steering decided to stop working, and that was a lot of fun. But other than that, I don't think that there are very many reliability issues, maybe some random um, electronic issues here and there, but for the most part, they're fine. I mean, it's not a super solidly built car, but it's not too bad either. I think it's a very solid choice. And just to add to this, I did mention the Saturn Ion Redline. This was another, you know, just another version of the Cobalt SS essentially, but you get this fancy suicide door for rear passengers if you have the coupe, and different wheels, same Ecotec engine, supercharged, pretty solid car. I'm sure you could E85 this car and it'd make really respectable horsepower and still get pretty good gas mileage. It's pretty simple. Oh, I will say, I have heard that the chain guides do break sometimes. There's plastic timing chain guides in these cars, which is, a very common thing across many cars. You could name almost any manufacturer. They've used like, well, I shouldn't go that far. Very common to use plastic timing chain guides in engines. It just is. Yeah, they're really not too difficult to replace, which is really good. You just have to remove this one engine mount, which is held on with these two bolts, remove the wheel, and then you can have access to everything you need around here. You just remove a plate that's on the side of the engine, and then you have direct access to the timing chain guide. But do your own research, of course, as I've repeatedly been trying to say. I would definitely. I mean, I like these cars. They're not expensive. They're gonna be fun. They're fairly light. They're definitely under 3,000 pounds. Why not? Especially if you're just looking to have some cheap fun. Number 15, the Saab 9.3. This car is definitely a black sheep when it comes to the Saab brand name. And this is because GM owned Saab at the time, or at least a very significant portion of them at the time. This Saab is known to be a GM Saab. I'm talking about the ones from 2003 up to when they stopped making them in 2013 or 14. The chassis platform shares a lot with the Saturn, and the engine also uses an Ecotec block, like I mentioned, with the Cobalt SS and the Ion Redline. It is very, very similar to those engines. However, what people don't really realize about this Saab is that it was designed very, very much by Saab. The exterior design, at the very least, was very Saab, and the interior as well. If you look at older Saabs, you can see like so much similarity in the design of the inside of them. It is definitely, definitely, in my eyes, it's still a very true Saab. If anything, once GM took Saab over, they became a lot less problematic and a lot more reliable than their reputation had in the past when it was just Saab doing it kind of on their own. And that's aside from the radio controls, because the radio controls are very much GM. It looks almost identical to the radio controls in every other GM at the time, but that's not necessarily a bad thing because very simple design and it works. With all that said, this engine, although it looks a lot, this engine right here is the Saab engine, right? Look at how similar this design is, at least from what's very obvious. This is the Ion Redline engine with the supercharger, and this is the Cobalt SS engine with the supercharger. And we're back at the Saab here. It is so similar. It is an Ecotec block. What Saab did was basically took the Ecotec block, upgraded the pistons, crankshaft, connecting rods, and they change the camshaft, and they handle all of the software tuning. And Saab is very well known for having a long history of turbocharging their engines, so they really know what they're doing. And another benefit of this is that because they use the Trionic 8 software, you can use open source software called Trionic Tuning, which allows you to basically plug in a computer with the free software downloaded and change the tune however you want. So if you're looking to learn a little bit or kind of a lot bit about engine tuning, a Saab might be the way to go if you just happen to be interested in learning about tuning engines. With that being said, it's not, in my experience, it's relatively complicated to understand, especially since the units aren't in units that I'm familiar with, being an American. They all use, metric system and all of that over there. And I didn't really dive into it, and I was a little too nervous to start messing with it myself and potentially blow something up. I know it's not that easy to blow it up, but um, you never know, especially when it comes to an engine that you don't want to have to replace. So that being said, let's get into the details a little bit of the Saab. Now, there are basically 2 or 3 trims you're going to look at. What's really nice about Saab is that the features that came with each Saab was very, very consistent across all of the different trim levels you could get. So they all have like leather interior, good radio. They all connect with an auxiliary cable, cruise control, whatever you want. But so the Linear came with a smaller Garrett turbo. I think it's like a 7 Garrett GT 1752 or something like that. Whereas the Aero has the bigger turbo. This turbo was a Mitsubishi TD04 14T, I believe. Might be a 16T. But either way, I'm pretty sure it's very similar, if not almost the same, as a WRX turbo. And one of the ways you can figure out if the Saab you're looking at has a bigger turbo or a smaller turbo is that there will literally be a smaller or larger T. This is a capital T because it's the Aero. And the Linear will have a lowercase t here. I feel like this is the nicest car you can get for your money. It is not a lightweight car. It weighs probably 3,300 pounds, maybe 3,250 or something like that. I personally owned two of these. One became a project and one was a daily driver. The daily driver was a lot like this one. It had an automatic transmission, which is totally fine. It's just going to be a comfortable car. And if you want to tune it, you can even swap in the bigger turbo for the smaller one. I ended up tuning it. I personally owned a Saab 9.3 Linear with the smaller Garrett turbo, but it was a project car. When I owned it, and with just 4 modifications, bigger fuel injectors, a different knock sensor, which is fairly easy to change, stronger clutch and flywheel, and a tune, I made over 330 horsepower and about 400 foot-pounds of torque, which was pretty insane and a lot of fun to drive, at least for me. And I was able to keep up with my friend's Focus RS on the highway, which is a lot of fun. It's just really fun to kind of have like that kind of sleeper car because nobody even knows what these are for the most part, which is part of the reason why I think they failed. I feel like like looking back, it was so hard to find any reviews on the Saab 9.3 in like most of the magazines and stuff, and I felt like it was very underappreciated. I don't know why GM wasn't able to keep them around, but then again, they didn't keep a lot of other brands around like Pontiac and any other brand. So because I had personal experience with 2 of these cars, I can say window regulators are pretty common to go bad, but that's kind of a common issue on a lot of cars that are 15 to 20 years old. If you are going to be modifying this car, get ready to be diagnosing turbo leaks. You need to upgrade those you'll definitely need to upgrade the turbo hose clamps, the turbocharge piping clamps. The stock ones are not strong enough, so get some nice E-bolt hose clamps. Very, very, very good, especially compared to the really awful worm gear clamps, because that comes stock, because those stock ones are just made to hold the stock power. They come with about 210 horsepower and a little bit more torque. I think it's like 220 torque or something like that. But once you start increasing that boost pressure, the hoses will not want to stay on. That was a very common issue for us when we were modifying this car, and it drove me crazy for the longest time until I finally got it sorted. But it can be a lot of fun, and otherwise, don't let too many people scare you away from these Saabs just because of, Saab's reputation with electronics and their electronics going bad. That's why I'm not really putting the older Saabs on this list, because I don't have enough faith in the older ones to be that reliable in terms of electronic issues. But the GM Saabs, I think they actually did a very solid job from owning two of them, in my experience. For number 16, the 350Z, the Nissan 350Z. I think you're gonna have to stretch your budget just a little bit again with most of these cars. It's just the way things are right now. You can't really buy very many cheap, reliable, fun cars with low mileage under 5 grand. But I am gonna keep the 350Z in here because it is only a little bit more for not too much more mileage than the other cars that I'm listing. So the 350Z kind of puts you in the next heavier weight class. They're not very lightweight at all. They're not too heavy. They're about the same weight as that Saab that I just mentioned, but it's not the same kind of car as the Saab. It's a sports car, right? But it still weighs like 3,200 pounds about. They're a little bit on the heavier side. And I'm also going to be including the G35 in this as well. The G35 weighs even more than the 350Z at like 3,500 pounds. You're going to get a few perks from that added weight, including rear seats. 350Zs do not have rear seats whatsoever. They are only two-seaters. And they kind of don't have as much cargo space as you might expect, because there's this giant, like, I think it's a strut tower bar back here, but it's kind of huge and not very practical for, moving a lot. It's just less storage space and cargo capacity than you might think in a 350Z. I'm also not that crazy about the interior of these. I think they look kind of outdated and really plasticky, kind of similar enough to that RSX back from that generation, but I think they look pretty cool. I've heard they're a lot of fun, and they're supposed to be pretty reliable. I don't have like pretty much any first-hand experience. I think I drove with G35 on an autocross once, which was a lot of fun. But from what I hear, the VQ engine is fairly dependable, pretty reliable. It made 287 horsepower from the factory, and they increased the power output to like 300 horsepower, and then finally to like 305 horsepower by the end of the 350Z's life, which is, a really respectable amount of power. But I have heard that some people have had really, really bad luck with these engines, basically just detonating on them, which isn't great either. So who you want to listen to, it's kind of up to you. Maybe just try to find one that's been well maintained and well kept. At this price range, though, it's going to be pretty hard. I'm not sure exactly why this car is so cheap. Maybe it's just in a really hard to get to location. $6,000, 93,000 miles. It looks fine. It looks kind of dusty. The paint's, a little bit rough, but I would definitely say get a manual transmission if you can. Yeah, I'd say overall these are a really solid choice. Yeah, so since they are pretty heavy cars, you're gonna need bigger tires if you're planning on going to the track or autocrossing. That's just the way it is when you have a heavier car. I have given these a little bit of thought myself. I do have friends who had a sedan, a lot like this one, had it tuned, and claim to make like a ton of horsepower out of the stock engine, which is great. I mean, more power to them, literally. And yeah, I'm sure it's, a really solid car, relatively upscale. It's not as nice as like the 370G, or sorry, the 370Z or the G37, but still, the cheap price. You get a really solid car, 136,000 miles, naturally aspirated, don't have to deal with turbo issues, and you get like almost 300 horsepower. So, not too much to complain about here. Parts aren't terribly rare for them, I don't think, but window regulators, I have heard, are very common to go out on this car, so be aware of that. But otherwise, I don't see why, you know, this wouldn't be a good option if you don't mind the extra cost of bigger tires and the more weight and maybe less gas mileage. One last point about the 350Z specifically. I've never been in a 350Z, but I have sat in a 370Z, and I remember feeling like the interior space was so small. I remember trying to use the clutch and my knee was hitting the steering wheel, and I'm like 5'9". I am like exactly average, if not on the little slightly shorter side. And I could barely feel that comfortable. So if I was totally comfortable in a G35, but the 370Z was not something I could figure out this proper seating position is. Maybe I just needed to try it again. I don't think the steering wheels are adjustable, so if you're taller or just like just don't go all in on the 350Z until you know you can be comfortable in the car itself. Just be aware. Number 17. I am listing the fourth generation Mustang, and I'm looping in the fifth generation Mustang as well. So you can now get some fourth generation Mustang GTs making 260 horsepower out of a V8 at a very reasonable price. These V8s are a 4.6 liter single overhead cam engines. Initially, they were released with 215 horsepower, and then in like 97, they bumped them up to 225. But then I would only recommend like a 96 probably or newer. I think it was 98 that they started actually making 260 horsepower, or releasing them with 268 horsepower. In 98, they started making 260 horsepower from the factory. So I'm sure there are a lot of details as to why exactly they increased the horsepower very slowly over the years. The nice thing about like really big displacement engines like V8s is that you don't have to modify them to an extreme to get a lot more power. Like doing the smaller modifications gives you a lot more gains compared to four-cylinder engines, for example. And they don't typically run as hot or they're usually not as stressed because they make less horsepower per liter, so they don't generate as much heat. If you do something like an intake and exhaust and camshafts, it's really common to also uh, increase the rear gear ratios, so you get more torque and faster acceleration times. With that being said, changing your gears will definitely give you worse gas mileage and make you run at a higher RPM all the time. But if you're willing to put up with that cost, especially if you're making a lot of torque and horsepower, you'll need bigger tires, which are more expensive as well. As long as you're putting up with the cost and know what you're getting into, it might be a really solid choice for you. Also, if you do choose to go with the, bigger budget modifications like turbos and superchargers, you can get a lot of power gains out of those as well, without spending an insane amount of money. Just know that the more mods you do, the more potential repairs you're going to be doing as well. Now, if you are only interested in straight line performance, this is a good option because this era of Ford as well as GM were not really focused much on making a really good handling car. These are very much straight line machines. I would say definitely be aware of what you're getting into. Also, I'm really not at all a fan of the interiors on this car either. It just feels like very cheap plastic that doesn't age very well, and I never understood the shape of this like really crooked shifter that they always came with. It just seemed really odd to me. There's obviously probably a reason for it. It just seems very weird. But yeah, and also the other thing is 260 horsepower isn't like a lot of horsepower, especially for a V8, considering not too much longer, Nissan came out with a V6 making like 40 more horsepower than this Mustang GT makes. But that being said, if you modify it in the right ways, and it can still be very reliable and make a lot more power with not like a whole lot of in-depth, like intense modification. Also, these probably aren't going to get great gas mileage. V8s typically don't unless the car is also very lightweight. Yeah, these cars have 140, 145, 140,000 miles on them, 120, 115. That's really not too bad, but you're again having to stretch your budget a little bit. So just be aware. These cars are a pretty solid choice if you specifically want more straight line speed than anything else. Now, I don't really know a whole lot about Mustangs because I've never been super interested in them. So please, again, do your own research. Don't just rely on what I'm telling you here in this random video. But the Mustang GTs in the next generation came with a more respectable 300 horsepower from the factory, which is really good. I mean, 300 horsepower isn't like an insane amount of power, especially today, but it'll still probably, hopefully, feel plenty fast for you. So just know that you're going to be looking at these cars with higher mileage. 190 is definitely pushing it for an older Ford. It really depends on the maintenance and how well it's been kept. But V8s are typically pretty reliable. And if you only plan on keeping the car for like 3 years anyway, how many miles are you going to put on it? 15,000 miles to 30,000 miles, especially if you're not driving because you don't have anywhere to go because of coronavirus. Yeah, I mean, you could probably get away with one of these, and especially with 115,000 miles, I would bet this would easily go to 150 with not too much maintenance. Interior on the newer ones, I still wasn't really a big fan of the interiors on these either. I guess I would take it over the previous generation, but still felt a lot like cheaper plastic. So take that for what you want. Number 18, the BMW 540i E39 chassis. As I get near the end of this list, I have a few more to go, but I am attempting to go through this list from generally least expensive to purchase and drive to most expensive to purchase and drive. I can't say I followed that to a T, but the reason I'm saying this now is because most BMWs have the potential to become money pits. So the 540i is known to be fairly reliable. It comes with a 4.4-liter V8, making 282 horsepower and 310 foot-pounds of torque. 310 pound-feet of torque. The interior space is far nicer than like anything else you're going to get for this price range, or anything else on the list that I've listed already. But that's because it's a luxury car and has the potential to be very expensive. However, this is actually like kind of somewhat of a golden age car for BMW. I think the styling looks quite amazing for the time, and it's holding up really well. Obviously, this one has some paint fading issues on the hood. But if you can get a good one out there, like you're also probably going to only find these with really high mileage. This one has 206,000 miles on it. But that kind of just proves that these engines can go so long. It's going to be rear wheel drive. It has a lot of torque, so the tires are going to be a bit more expensive. But the engine is relatively simple. It's not turboed or supercharged. I think that as long as you maintain this well, it should be fairly reliable and not really break down on you. But just in case it does, be prepared. Other than repair and running costs, I don't have too much bad to say about this car, really. I've seriously thought about buying this too. I mean, you're almost getting M5 reliability. Well, sorry, you're getting probably better than M5 reliability, but almost M5 performance for a lot less money than you can buy an M5 of this generation. M5s have gone up a good bit recently as well. I mean, I would say you could probably go either way with an automatic or manual, but me personally, I would say definitely get the manual. Manual 540i's are just so much fun to drive. Manual BMWs in general, I mean, they're made to drive well and be a lot of fun. If you stretch your budget, you can get this low mileage 96,000 mile car for 10 grand. I mean, I know that's probably more than most of you are wanting to spend, but still think it's worth putting on this list. Also, you're not going to get very good gas mileage. uh, City mile per gallon is going to be probably about what it's rated for at 15 miles per gallon, which is pretty bad. And then 24 for the highway. I would just expect to just get close to 15 miles per gallon everywhere because this is an old car. It's big, it's heavier, needs bigger tires, but it's pretty classy looking and it rides really well. So that's all I have to say about this. Yeah, I'd say this is a good option if you're looking for something a little bit more fancy and you can afford to make any repairs and payments. I can't foresee like a ton of issues with this car happening. It's a pretty straightforward engine. I think this would be a great car for someone who wants something a little bit bigger and more substantial. Now, speaking of BMWs, we have the 330i E46. I've noticed a lot of these 330i's are starting to become more difficult to find with lower miles and at lower prices, especially with the ZHP packages. Those really hold their value around like $10,000 in good shape. But the base, 330i, I've owned one for about 6 months now, and I will gladly put this on this list, even though it is getting difficult to find them at lower mileage and prices. I would certainly say go with the manual transmission for sure, and the XI. I've been told by one person not to go with the all-wheel drive system if you can avoid it. That being said, I don't know enough about it personally, so if you do want all-wheel drive, maybe it's something to look into. But I love the 330i. I think this car will definitely become a classic, even though it has the M3 to kind of compete with in that regard. But I think it will eventually become classic because it's a very, very well designed, good looking car. Very handsome, but not overstyled in any way, in my opinion. It just has really good proportions and looks really great. And the interior stays in like such good shape for somehow. Aside from the headliner. The headliner always, always, always starts sagging in these cars, but it's basically sagged completely in my car, and I don't even notice it. Like if I didn't know any better, I wouldn't realize that it was sagging. But I really, really enjoy driving this car. It has an inline six, a 3-liter inline naturally aspirated engine, the 6-cylinder. Mine currently has 116,000 miles. And the previous owner really just replaced the essential coolant lines, which is a common issue on these cars to go bad. So get the whole cooling system replaced if you do end up buying one of these. And it should take pretty good care of you. Do a belt change as well for, the accessory belt, certain serpentine belt, fan belt, whatever you want to call it. And honestly, the Harman Kardon sound system like kind of blew me away the first time I listened to it because I was like, I can't believe this car is so cheap and you get this good of a sound system and it drives beautifully. I love the way it drives. The engine is so smooth, a lot of fun. It sounds really great even with the stock exhaust. But I know I'm kind of talking up this car a bit too much at this point. So what can I say that's bad about this car? I have noticed certainly that the steering wheel has started to peel off. Like whatever it's wrapped in just kind of starts degrading over time, and I think it's a pretty common issue on these steering wheels for some reason. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's just mine. Maybe it just sat in the sun too much. I don't know. This one has a steering wheel cover, if that tells you anything. But yeah, and this one happens to be supercharged, so if you want to go pick up this uh, supercharged 330i, you can go ahead and pick that one up. But other than that, I haven't really had any issues. That being said, I've only owned it for 6 months, but probably a reason why they are seemingly holding their value even with like super high mileage. Yeah, this one's only $3,300. Um, this one's $3,000 with 230,000 miles, which is insane. But I have been told that you can actually replace and find a used engine from a junkyard for like $500 because they made so many of these. BMW sold a lot of 330i's and just E46s in general. I would even go as far to say like you could look for like a 325i or a 323 and have practically the same experience. You won't get the extra horsepower from the bigger displacement engine, but it'll still look really solid. It'll have less miles than a 330i, and I'm sure it'd be a lot of fun. Like this 323i doesn't make a ton of power, but it'll have a little bit better gas mileage, and you'll still get kind of all the niceties of owning a BMW to an extent. I wouldn't go with the automatic transmission personally. I don't know enough about them. I generally only recommend manual transmissions. I just don't really like to recommend automatics because I would hate for someone to have to replace an automatic transmission shortly after they buy it because it's kind of hard to predict and they just generally tend to go out kind of easily and they're really expensive to replace and repair. So I think that's all I really have to say about it. They are getting more difficult to find, which is why I almost didn't put this on this list, but I thought, why not? It's a solid car. You can still find this one right here with a manual transmission, 122,000 miles, $5,000. There you go. One is supercharged though, so I'm really hesitant about this particular one. But gas mileage, it's claimed to get 21 miles per gallon city and 30 highway. I've never gotten over 21 miles per gallon, maybe 22 miles per gallon. I mostly do highway driving. Don't expect to get very good gas mileage. You'll probably get about 20. All right, so number 20, the Volkswagen GTI. So when I was in high school, I didn't really like the Mark IV GTI, the fourth generation. This car kind of just reminded me a little bit too much of like a mini minivan, but they really started growing on me a lot after like 4 or 5 years. The 1.8T engine is definitely an interesting one. It's a smallish displacement engine with a turbo, and as far as I'm aware, it's kind of limited in terms of power output. From what I can read, it's really mixed. You have some people saying, "Oh, the 1.8T is, good for only 250 to maybe 300 horsepower," and other people saying, "Oh, you can go well over 350 horsepower." And if I were personally going to own this car with the intention of modding it, I'd probably keep it under 300 horsepower at the maximum. The interior is going to be a little bit nicer. It's all leather. I would never, ever, ever recommend an automatic transmission for this car, though. So just be aware of that. So do not get automatic transmission here. I have had friends who had a lot of issues with their transmission in this car. Also, I have heard of a lot of people having bad experiences with the electronics in most Volkswagens. I don't know why Volkswagen and Audi just like can't get it together in terms of their transmissions and at least their older transmissions, the automatics specifically. The manuals seem to be fine though, so just go with the manual if you can. And the Jetta is basically the same thing as a Golf, it's just a little bit longer. So if you want either one of these, I think that's a pretty solid way to go. The GLI is certainly the highest highest like trim level you can get with the Jetta. At least it's supposed to have like a nicer interior and all of that. But the VR6 also that these came with is not quite an inline six and not quite a V6. It's kind of like slightly in between. So you have the exhaust port only on one side and the intake only on the other side. But it's a really interesting engine. It sounds kind of amazing. It's not the most efficient engine, but it is very solidly built. And I think it comes with about 250 horsepower. That being said, in a front wheel drive car, that's going to be a lot of weight just in over the front wheels. It's not going to feel very balanced. Probably going to have a lot of understeer. But if you're not really caring that much about, the specific driving experience when you're really trying to push the limit or just approaching the limit, then maybe the VR6 might be the way to go. It should be pretty robust and reliable, but only get a manual transmission. Do not get the automatics. I cannot stress that enough. Sorry to say that anybody out there who has a automatic. The 1.8T is kind of controversial in terms of reliability because some people claim engine sludge happens like immediately and it's inevitable, whereas I've heard a lot of other people who I would probably trust more. As long as you know the correct oil to use in these engines and you keep up on maintenance, always use full synthetic. I recommend full synthetic oil in every single car out there pretty much, as far as I'm aware. I'm not, an oil expert, but I do know that synthetic oil is definitely always going to have better protective properties, especially after the end of its like proper life cycle. After all the protective coatings have like all worn off and burnt off, like definitely get full synthetic. With that being said, I would be much more trusting of the 1.8 turbo engine. As I said, the only thing I'm less sure about are the electronics. I don't have enough personal experience at all with these. I don't know enough people who have personally owned them to know how bad they can get. I do have a friend of a friend who had a diesel Golf who said the electronics were just awful and it's left him stranded a couple times, so just be aware. Now, grouping in the Mark V GTI, this one is kind of like the black sheep of the GTI world because people really, really do not like this design. I think it's because the headlights are too bubbly and like the rear end is just too curvy compared to the previous generation, or pretty much all of the previous generations of GTIs and Golfs and Rabbits, which is much more rounded out. But I think the interior looks pretty good. It's much more similar to Audi, and it comes with a DSG transmission, like a dual clutch transmission, which is pretty amazing and very fast shifting. So definitely go with one of these. This is one of the very few cars that I actually recommend to people who prefer automatic transmissions. Although you could certainly go with the manual transmission as always, because it shifts so fast. It's going to be a lot of fun to use those paddle shifters. And I don't understand why they're so undervalued. Maybe the electronic issues are just so bad that nobody recommends buying them and nobody keeps them for very long. But in the Mark V GTI, it made 200 horsepower, bumped up from the 1.8T's 160, I think it was, or 180. The 2.0 turbo in the Mark V has a lot of good potential. I'm pretty confident about that based on what I've read. You can make like 350, almost 400 horsepower pretty reliably on the Mark V GTI. And you can put down some very, very impressive quarter mile times without doing anything to the engine. Just maybe you'll have to upgrade the turbo if you really want to, but just with like a tune, probably E85, exhaust, intake, bigger intercooler, maybe good way to go, especially if you're prepared to put up with electronic issues. But I don't mind the Mark V that much in terms of looks. Yes, most people think it's still kind of the black sheep, but I think it's a very you know, more respected car to people who aren't car people, if that makes any sense. It's more adult or than a lot of the other cars that I've listed. Like this one right here. This is a 2010, a sixth generation GTI, and it's only 8 grand with 81,000 miles. This is kind of blowing my mind a little bit, but maybe the electronic issues are just too much. If you know the answer to that question, please feel free to enlighten me because I do not know the answer. But I like this Mark 6 especially. I think these look really great. I would definitely do four doors just because you can get, it's just a lot more practical, a lot easier to haul stuff around whenever you need to put something in the back seat. Yeah, I like these cars. So I do generally recommend them, but I do also add, the disclaimer that Volkswagens are known to have electronic issues, but if you're willing to risk those kinds of things, this might be a good choice for you. It basically sums up my list, but I do want to take a little bit of time for honorable mentions, and I'll include why they didn't really make my list. First one would be Volvos in general. Volvos, just like Saabs, Volvos have a very long history of turbocharging their engines, right? So they really know what they're doing when it comes to turbocharging and forced induction. I mean, back in, I think, 2016, they ended up making a supercharged and turbocharged engine, which I heard has just been okay from a lot of reviewers in terms of what the engine is performance-wise, but I'm sure it'll be fairly reliable. But it just seems that you can really get a lot of Volvos for very cheap. And I'm not just talking about the old like 240s, which can be a lot of fun too. I'm talking about the more modern ones from like 2000 and newer. Let's see. Let's go to 2000, see what we get. Like the S40, S80, S60, T6. I would be willing to bet that you can tune these and make a lot of power out of them. I do remember vaguely looking into these. A lot of people nickname these Volvos like turbo bricks, which is more referencing the older ones than the newer ones, but they still do kind of keep those very squared off looks into the early 2000s, especially. Even today, they're still pretty squared off. But yeah, they have a lot of experience turbocharging their engines. I'm sure they can be a lot of fun for some people. I simply just don't know enough about them to recommend them, and that's the main reason why they didn't make the cut. One specific addition to this honorable mention is the C30 T5. So if you're unaware, Ford actually released a Focus ST far long before they ever brought it over to the United States. Now, this one specifically essentially has the same exact engine as this Volvo C30 T5, which uses a very unique 5-cylinder inline 5-cylinder engine with a turbo. It has a good amount of cargo space. It's very European if you're that kind of car person where you really like the idea of kind of having the status of very European car, but uses a 5-cylinder turbo engine, which is pretty cool. I don't think it makes a ton of power. I don't remember if they came in manual transmission. Yeah, apparently they did make manual transmissions for these cars. Be willing to bet this is a lot of fun too. I just don't know enough about them personally. I don't think about them a lot personally. I don't know if they have like a ton of modding potential, but I always have really liked the design overall of these. Yeah, I could potentially see myself like kind of getting into like one of these and deciding to say, oh yeah, sure, why not? You know, once these are super cheap, I could maybe just say, okay, I'll buy one for a couple of grand just to have fun with. But yeah, 0.5 liter inline 5, 20 valve, dual overhead cam turbo. Solid car, solid choice. If you do know more about Volvos and want to educate me, feel free to, educate me all you want about cars because I will listen and I love learning about them. So, I'm enjoying just looking through these right now. This looks pretty cool. This looks pretty fun. Yeah. Decent interior. It's a little plain on the inside. That's my only complaint. I feel like it just looks kind of boring, but Volvo always, as well as Saab, had always focused on being really safe cars and making really ergonomic, comfortable seats, things like that. So I'm sure it's a nice, solid car. So the RX-8, Mazda RX-8, the last RX model that Mazda ever made, at least until this point. There's always rumors that Mazda's going to come out with another RX engine, but they never believe them that they're actually going to do it, just because the RX engine was never known for its reliability at all, and it was never known for very good gas mileage either. However, the RX-8 was very, very well respected when it was first released, specifically for its handling ability. But there's an obvious downside to this car. RX, if you don't know, stands for Rotary Experiment. These cars use the infamous Wankel engine, the rotary engine, which does have some upside, but they're very lightweight engines. They have very few moving parts compared to the conventional piston engine. The downside is that they're really known to lose compression around 80 to 100,000 miles. And if you're not familiar, compression is really important for properly running engine because essentially they need to compress the air-fuel mixture coming into the combustion chamber to have an efficient burn and power output. One of the reasons for a loss of compression in this rotary engine is because the apex seals start wearing out. Another reason might be because there are carbon deposits that happen on the walls of the combustion chamber. Supposedly, one of the ways you can reduce the carbon deposits is to rev out the engine to redline as much as you can when you drive it, or at least once every time you drive it, or something along those lines. This is known as an Italian tune-up, when you rev the crap out of an engine because you need to blow all that carbon out of the combustion chamber, which is, it does actually have its merits. It isn't like a totally bogus kind of theory. It actually does work in certain circumstances, but whether or not that does for the RX-8 is unclear. You'll see people on forums saying these engines can last so long if you just do the regular maintenance. You have some people reaching 120,000 miles or more without having any engine failure. And you have people on the other end of the spectrum doing all of the basic maintenance, all of the very specific, like, rumored things to make the engine last longer, like premixing and all of that. And then they have engine failure around like 50,000 miles or less in some cases. So it just seems like it's too unclear about whether or not these engines will last very long or how long they will last for. So even though you can buy one for very, very cheap, I did not feel comfortable putting it on this list. But I am going to try to talk up this car a little bit. It is a much more practical car of this type and for a sports car, and it's very cheap for what you can buy them for. It has those suicide rear doors, which are kind of nice if you need to, fit more people in the car. As I said, there aren't very many moving parts to this engine, so if you do need to have an engine rebuild, it's really not super expensive to actually take out the engine and rebuild it compared to a different car where you blow a piston. There's much more intensive work that goes into rebuilding a cylinder piston engine. Another negative to these cars is that I've heard that you really can't turn them on and off in a short period of time and then expect to turn it back on in a very short period. I don't know why that is. Might be engine flooding, might just be the way the engine wants to start cold. I really do not know. But just there do seem to be a lot of quirks to having this engine. However, if you do get one of these with the fresh engine rebuild, you could hopefully expect it to last. I would expect it to last at least 80,000 miles, which is plenty for most car owners in the time they buy and sell. Between the time they buy and sell a car, most people don't drive one car for 80,000 miles. Another kind of quirk to this engine is that you really, really need to make sure you're not running low on engine oil, because this car uses and consumes engine oil based on its design. It injects some amount of oil. But otherwise, other than that, oil changes are pretty much the same process. Otherwise, it's the same process as any other car doing an oil change. Also, sometimes these cars tend to overheat. They're not great at separating the distance from the intake port and the exhaust port on the engine block themselves. So that's a pretty significant downside if you're in a particularly hot area where it's really, really warm year-round especially, or just in the summers when you can't depend on your car. That's why these are so cheap though. They're pretty modern on the inside, but there's a reason why they are so cheap, and as cheap as they are. Also, if you are committed to this car, do get a manual transmission, because for whatever reason, the automatics that they put in this either can't handle as much horsepower, or I don't know what the reason was, but the engines have less horsepower in the automatic transmission. I don't know why that is, but that is just what I have read. 8,500 RPM is a lot of fun to rev to. Similar output to an S2000, right? So the car makes about 237 horsepower, which is very similar to the Honda S2000, which actually weighs about the same. RX-8 only weighs about 3,000 pounds compared to an S2000's. I think it's 27 or 2,800 pounds. It's not too much heavier and revs to the same RPM range and makes the same amount of horsepower. But in this, you have a lot more storage capacity. You have rear seats. Another downside is that you don't get a middle rear seat, so you can't. You can only carry 3 other people instead of 4 when you need to. But you do get a trunk that's very usable, and you do get to be a part of the No Pistons Club, which I know people are very proud to say when they own these cars. You do get to kind of have that pride of owning a very unique engine and unique car. It's kind of like the last of its kind to an extent, and it's very cheap. And speaking of S2000s, you kind of get very similar performance of an S2000, but you don't have to pay the 15-ish $1,000 or more upfront cost of an S2000, but you get much more cargo capacity, much more usability as a daily driver to an extent. S2000 overall is going to be far more reliable than an RX-8 ever will be, but if you're willing to do an engine rebuild on an RX-8, maybe it's worth it, especially if you're going to do it yourself and you like that kind of thing. Maybe the RX-8 is a better way to go because it's a easier car to live with every day. It's probably a lot quieter. You don't have to worry about soft tops being ripped, and much quieter on the inside. So I can see the case for the RX-8, but I think it's very specific to very hardcore enthusiasts. One last downside to this car is supposedly it is capable of getting, I don't know, what is the rating? 18 miles per gallon city and 24 miles per gallon highway. Every single RX-8 owner I've ever met has had a lot of difficulty even reaching 18 miles per gallon. So don't expect to get very good gas mileage in this car either. So I've rambled enough about this RX-8. They're cheap and modern, and they rev high, and they're probably a lot of fun when they're working, but I don't personally think that it's worth owning one unless you are just really passionate about Mazda, really passionate about owning a unique car, or really like rebuilding engines on your own. So my final thoughts after this much longer video than I anticipated. If reliability is important to you and you plan on adding power to the engine with a tune only, I would strongly suggest staying away from turbos or superchargers. But if you do have to go with one of them, I would lean toward a supercharged engine because it will have probably less issues than a turbo will have. There are just less coolant lines, less air lines of boost where boost leaks can happen. But if you're looking for higher horsepower than stock, for the fun of having that higher horsepower, either because it makes a ton of horsepower after you tune it, or just because you want a sleeper, or whatever is the case, then a turbo or supercharged car is the way to go if you are looking for big power gains on less money. Aside from the Mazda Speed Miata or the Mazda Speed Protege, or maybe even the 1.8T GTI or Jetta, I probably would go turbocharged in that case. Otherwise, if you're willing to put more money into it and you're willing to deal with the cost of worse gas mileage and worse running costs, repair costs, higher costs, then a V8 is the way to go. You can get, some cars with LS swaps or whatever. If you can find a V8 that's solid, generally speaking, they're easier to make more horsepower on. But turbochargers are the way to go if you're looking for moderate to higher horsepower on less of a budget, as long as you're willing to put up with the reliability issues. E85 is a fantastic way to go to make power in turbo cars, but just keep in mind with more modification comes more potential for issues. I would take weight into account because then you have generally saved both on gas consumption as well as tires as they need to be replaced, and potentially even oil changes. If overall running costs and purchase price are your main concern, you want to keep overall costs low as possible. Go with the most simple car you can find that is the lightest weight, the lightest, simplest engine. So that means no turbo, no supercharger, probably four-cylinder, most likely front-wheel drive. You can do the MIATA, that kind of fits pretty much all of those requirements. You can get better gas mileage in a front-wheel drive car just because they are pretty light. The MIATA just doesn't get as good of gas mileage as you might expect from a four-cylinder engine. Lightness is always going to be your friend in terms of cost because you need less gas. Usually, oil changes are cheaper, less tires, but if you want to get really good autocross or track times, you'll make turns quicker. You can add a little bit of power here and there, and it'll go much further for your power to weight ratio. So you'll generally accelerate as well as brake faster when you have a very lightweight car. I hope this has been really helpful to some of you out there or someone you know who is interested in buying a good, reliable, fun car for really cheap. Let me know in the comments what cars I've missed or what cars should have been added to this list or some cars that you have an experience with that I didn't, touch on at all, or maybe your car's on this list and you hated your car and think it shouldn't even be on this list at all. I'd be more than happy to do videos on specific cars to get my opinions on them, what I like and dislike on each car. I'd also be more than willing to correct any misinformation I'm putting out there that I'm unaware of. I'm sure there's something I got massively wrong, and I'd love to hear you tell me about it because I don't want to keep thinking that I have information that's accurate that is completely wrong. And I've also noticed while making this video that some of these cars are becoming increasingly difficult to find at these prices with under 100,000 miles. That's kind of a result of a number of factors. One being these cars are getting old, 15 to 20 years old. It's going to be really hard to find cars that are under 100,000 miles at that point. Also, I think because of the economic situation at the moment, a lot of people are starting to lose their jobs. So used cars are actually kind of increasing in value, which is part of the reason why I'm stretching out the budget here in this video to approach more like $7,000 to $8,000, even though that's almost doubling a $5,000 budget. It's just kind of, hard to find really cheap, fun cars for this cheap. But I think a lot of people are selling their cars or picking up the cheapest used cars that are going to be reliable while they are currently thinking in the short term they might not have as much income for something that's more expensive to run. And finally, there's really no such thing as a perfect car, especially for under $10,000. And trust me, I've really looked pretty hard, and I continue to look for really solid cars, but just find what you want. First determine what you want, then go out and look for it. You want to get something you'll enjoy because life's too short to buy boring cars. Life's too short to drive boring cars. Please do subscribe. Please hit that like button. And please leave a comment. Help me out a lot if you can. Just click that like button. Let me know what you're enjoying, what you're not enjoying. That's fine too. Just let me know in the comments if you have anything to add, any kind of feedback. I do appreciate. Thank you very much for watching, and I really hope to see you guys out there. I hope this been. I hope this been. God, I'm really exhausted.